Good morning. This is Dan with Cochise County in the budget office. We'll go ahead and get started. I've got Stephen Shepard from the Joint Legislative Budget Committee on Microsoft Teams. So bear with us as we sort this out. Stephen, can you hear me good? Give me a thumbs up.
I can hear you well.
All right, I'm gonna take care of a couple of housekeeping updates here, and then I will ask you to share your screen again, and then you'll take over, and then it'll be on you until we do some Q&As, and we'll have to figure out how I can talk and then you can talk. So we'll take it from there.
Okay.
So today we've got Stephen Shepard from the Joint Legislative Budget Committee up in Phoenix. They're the bipartisan group that puts the state budget together for the two houses of the legislature up there in Phoenix. We'll hear from him about the state budget, the process, and how it's looking this year. And then after, I'll talk a little bit about budget history, types, and the adoption process and how that filters down here at our local level. So, and I do have, get it up here. I do have our full dates of topics and guest speakers, and they're up here. So next week we'll have Dr. Hammond from the U of A Economic and Business Research Center. June 19th we'll have Victoria Yarborough from the City of Sierra Vista. On June 26th we'll talk to Michael Townsend, the administrator for the Public Safety Personnel Retirement System. And on July 10th we'll wrap it up with our Cochise County Administrator here at Gilligan. And I will get these up on the website with the current slides and the recordings of all the sessions. All right, let's see if we can do this. Stephen, do you want to hit the share button on your end again?
Sure.
Then you'll be off to the races here.
Okay, can everyone see a slideshow?
Yeah, I see it, Stephen, their presentation to Cochise County.
Okay, so I should take it away?
Yeah, it's you. Thank you so much.
Sure, okay. And thank you, Daniel, for asking me to talk to y'all this morning. My presentation is sort of in three parts. The first part is just going to go into a little detail about what the Joint Legislative Budget Committee actually is and sort of how and what role we play in the overall budget process for the state. The second is going to give a 30,000-foot overview of the state budget, sort of very big picture overview, so everyone has a sense of what the state budget looks like. And then part three is going to be going into a little more detail about what the state budget looks like now in the wake of the pandemic. So
right now, and I've got somebody speaking. So if the link's not working, will you email me then?
Okay. So.
All right. Yeah, I'm working on that. So let me see if I can get it fixed.
Daniel, do you want me to proceed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So what is the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, or JLBC? So let me first talk a little bit about what the JLBC staff does. And so as Daniel mentioned, we're a nonpartisan staff. We're a legislative agency. We've got about 20 people roughly on our staff. One of our biggest responsibilities is to develop a baseline estimate of available resources after statutory requirements, and we do that at the beginning of session. So in January, we published a baseline which said this is how much money we think we're going to take in for state general fund revenue, and based on the statutory requirements we have, this is how much money we think we're going to spend, and this is the difference. And in good years, that number is a positive number, and in bad years, that number is a negative number. So most of our staff are analysts, and they each have responsibility for a varying number of state agencies, both from the very biggest, the Department of Education, or access to the very smallest agencies that, have like $100,000 budget. We also have a few people who work on the revenue side, and they're forecasting the revenue that comes in, from the sales tax or the property tax or the income tax. Then, after we produce the baseline, and that process takes place, starting in September when we and even before when we first get agency budget requests. Then, after we produce the baseline, we help the legislature produce a final budget. So our document isn't a policy document, unlike the way that the governor's budget is a policy document. So the governor and the governor's budget office does the same thing. They try to figure out how much money they think they have or the shortfall they need to make up. But unlike the JLBC baseline, the governor's budget will actually typically spend some of that money or provide specific solutions, their recommended solutions. So our job is to help the legislature figure out how to do what they want to do, figure out what of the governor's stuff they want to do, and finally produce that budget, both in terms of providing the analytical expertise as well as simply helping them to draft the budget bills necessary to implement that. At the same time,
I think we're having an issue with the sound. Can I try to send your camera live and we'll see if that works?
Sure.
That's okay with you?
Yeah.
All right, let me replace your camera with your PowerPoint with your with your camera, and we'll see if that works. Okay. So somebody could chime in on the comments and see if we can see and hear Stefan now. So yeah, keep going and they'll let us know if it's working. Okay.
At the same time, while we're working on budget issues, we're also responding to information requests from all 90 legislators. That can be sort of technical questions about agency budgets or what an agency is doing. That can also be producing what we call fiscal notes. Those are cost estimates of bills. And so any member can ask us to say, what is your best estimate of what this particular bill will cost? And then the other thing that we do is major thing that we do is that we provide briefing materials and analysis for the 16-member Joint Legislative Budget Committee. So there's actually a committee called the JLBC. They're an oversight committee consisting of members from both the House and Senate, from both parties. And so that's a way that the legislature can do some oversight of particular items, especially in the interim when the full legislature isn't around. Does that work better for everyone?
Yeah, I think the sound is great. I've got some chats, so please keep going. If we're gonna have to pivot, and we can't do the slideshow and the sound at this point in time.
Okay, so let me, assuming there aren't any questions in the chat about what it is that we do, let me move on, and this is the only slide I have in here. So let me move on to the state budget basics, and then maybe after these, I think I've got about 3 slides in here. That might be a good time to pause to take questions. Okay. So these are estimates that are frankly a little out of date, because these were estimates from January for fiscal year 2020 general fund revenue, and the state's fiscal year is the same as the county's fiscal year. It runs July 1st through June 30th. So this was the set of estimates that we'd made back in January for the current fiscal year. And as you can see on the slide, primarily the state get our revenues from the sales and use tax and from the individual income tax. Combined, they provide us about 87% of our general fund revenue. In addition to that, we have the insurance premium tax, which is effectively sort of like a sales tax, but for insurance premiums. We have the corporate income tax, and then there are all other revenue categories for us combined to make about 5% of the state's budgeted general fund revenue. So at the time, we thought we were going to take in about $11.9 billion general fund revenues, and as a just as a point of clarification, that is prior to the amount of monies that we share to cities through what's called urban revenue sharing. So that's a program that does not involve the counties, it's just cities, but that is one of the state's major revenue sharing components. Then you ask, where do those monies go? Well, this next slide shows where the general fund appropriations go by percentage, and about 6 agencies account for 85% of the spending. And the largest general fund agency by far is the Arizona Department of Education, or ADE, and so that's the agency through which our education formula is run through. So $5.2 billion of the state's general fund budget in fiscal year 20 goes to the Department of Education. That's about 44% of the state's budget. The next largest component is for access, and that's healthcare for low-income and disabled people. And about $1.9 billion general fund goes to access for that program. About $1.2 billion for corrections. That's just the Department of Corrections on the state level. That doesn't include county jails or those sorts of facilities. Universities get about $775 million of state general fund monies. DES also gets about $750 million. DES, the biggest component of DES is the developmentally disabled program, at least in terms of general fund revenues. Department of Child Safety, our CPS agency, gets about $385 million. And then there are other agencies, School Facilities Board, which provides capital funding for schools. That appropriation, this pie chart happens to include monies that we deposited into the Budget Stabilization Fund, which is also sometimes known as the Rainy Day Fund, includes everything else. So that all totaled for fiscal year 20, $11.9 billion. And one other comment before I just talk about sort of the process of putting together a budget, and that is the state is different, I think, from counties, cities, in that, and most other states, in that we do not appropriate federal funds. The legislature does not appropriate federal funds, and so there is, $11–12 billion worth of general fund expenditures, but the total state budget is more like $40 billion. The legislature has some control over some non-general fund funds, but there are a number of funds that the legislature doesn't have appropriation control over, and with a handful of exceptions, the legislature doesn't have control over federal funds. So unlike a county budget or a city budget where Board of Supervisors is approving a budget that's from all sources, most of the effort on the state level is just around this general fund portion, this $11–12 billion general fund portion. And then one last slide about sort of what we do in terms of putting together a budget is a slide here on 3 aspects of creating a budget. One thing that we are trying to do is manage some risk in developing the baseline revenue and spending forecast. So we were, when we put together our baseline in January, one of the things we said is, we've had this expanding economy for 10 years. We don't know what might happen. And of course, we saw what might happen, and that is obviously that has upended everybody's budget planning. So one of the things that we just tried to emphasize, and we try to emphasize every year, but has been particularly important this year, is that we're trying to manage risk in terms of not trying to have unrealistic expectations relative to our revenue and spending forecast. A second thing we tried to do, at least in the baseline, or we think that it was important that members tried to do, was maintain ongoing and cash balances through the 3-year planning period. We are required, our office is required by statute to produce like a 3-year budget forecast. That budget forecast doesn't have to be balanced. You know, again, our forecast is just a baseline. It's here's what we think we're taking in, and here's what we think we have to spend under statutory formulas. So budgets don't have to be balanced on an ongoing basis. The cash balance doesn't have to be positive in out years, but it is a way to help guide the legislature to make sure that they're not making a bunch of spending decisions that would result in significant budget problems in out years. And then obviously a broad statement, and this is not something, again, that we're doing. We're not elected. We're nonpartisan staff. This is a job for the elected members of the legislatures. You have to send revenue and spending priorities. What is it that they want to focus on? Because we don't have unlimited resources, and the legislature is going to need to decide what they want to focus on. And so I think, Dan, this is probably a good place for me to just pause for a moment, and if there are questions in the chat, I can try to answer them, and if there weren't, then I will just press on.
Stefan, we don't have any questions in the chat right now. I do have a question.
Okay.
Today, after your presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about budget history and types, and looking at the 3 levels of government. We're going to hear about how the budget has moved in some places from the legislative to the executive branch. Like in your municipalities and counties, the budget is created by the executive and then adopted by the legislature. Could you clarify those roles at the state level?
Yeah, I would say that compared to many states, the budget process is a little more legislatively driven in Arizona, which is not to say that the governor isn't controlling or isn't in the driver's seat or have the primary role to play, but there are not necessarily many agencies like our agency in other states. And so certainly, you know, every legislative branch is going to have their budget staff, but to have a nonpartisan budget staff with, you know, a full-time staff, you know, of our size, that is definitely the exception and not the rule. So there is certainly some greater legislative involvement here, I think, than in a number of other states. And I think the other thing that helps the legislature stay somewhat more involved in the budget process than perhaps some other states is the fact that we effectively are the scorekeepers. Like in other states, I think the governor's office may be more the scorekeeper. We are the scorekeeper. Now, you know, most of the policy issues that could be being discussed could be proposed by the executive, but in Arizona, we're the ones that sort of produce all the spreadsheets and do all the evaluation relative to the cost of the budget proposals. And so I definitely think the executive is the primary driver, and maybe that's shifted a little bit further to the executive over the nearly 25 years that I've been doing this. But I would say compared to other states, ironically, you know, while we don't have a lot of control over federal funds, and that makes the legislature weaker than the executive, I think we probably have more input and discussion on the general fund side than they may have in other states. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's good information. We started talking last week, you know, about the federal fiscalism and push and pull with the different levels of government, and then also within the branches of the government, each level. So that's very interesting for us. And we're building up to where the budget fits in. So it's interesting to hear how the state of Arizona does it. Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome. Then with that, let me go into sort of what the state budget looks like now, which is not what it looked like 3 months ago. And just to give you some sense, I mean, the slides that I'm showing now were created in early April when we last provided a major update to the legislature. And so I'll talk a little bit where appropriate, where we have a little more information from what these slides say. But I'm going to cut to the chase in terms of the summary, and that is, the first statement, state revenue forecast is going to be linked to the future of the pandemic. That is not an earth-shattering statement. And trying to figure out what the virus is going to do is difficult because those virus forecasts are speculative. They change weekly. In some cases, back in April, they seem to be changing significantly daily. And as much as certainly the government can talk about opening or closing certain businesses and what people may or may not be allowed to do, but in the end, a lot of what people are going to do are going to be based on how comfortable people feel doing things, and that's going to be based on the course of the pandemic. So we are not epidemiologists. I have a graduate degree. It is not in epidemiology, and even the epidemiologists are having problems, difficulties, and are trying to figure out what might happen. So that is we deal in uncertainty, obviously, in revenue forecasting. This is even greater uncertainty. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that we said, well, we think we may have a $1.1 billion shortfall, but we could be wrong by $500 million in either direction. That is, I think, we are by no means overconfident about our ability to project revenues. I think we try to be pretty humble and in terms of what we think might happen, but this is even more, the uncertainty is even greater than we typically deal with. And as a result, we didn't want to help develop plans for resolving the shortfall in the very near term, which was like, we didn't think that we should probably have the legislature try to solve the budget problem in mid-April because we just didn't have enough information. And so we planned to revisit the forecast at least once prior to the start of the fiscal year, and that's still true. We have not done. Sorry, yes, Daniel? I
just wanted to jump in and let you know that IT sent me a message and I sent your slides live, and it sounds like your slides and sounds are good. So okay. Keep going and use the PowerPoint, and thanks for bearing with me.
Great. We do plan to revisit the forecast, but we've not done that yet. So we still plan to do that, but we don't have that yet. So in terms of forecasting state revenues, I mean, prior to the pandemic, the state was doing well. And, you probably saw that on the county level as well. Through March, the state's general fund revenues were up by 8%. And when we looked at other states, there's a national group that called Federal Funds Information for the States, and they put together an index of economic momentum, and Arizona continued to rank third. So we were doing well. But as we noted in our January presentation, we have no recession through fiscal year 23. Recessions are hard to predict. However, that's usually due to a shock, and that is that we have just had a textbook example of that sort of recession. Now, I think there was some economic data out today. The unemployment rate was 13%, which normally and still is disastrous, but actually was less than the prior month, and so it does appear that the recession, technically speaking, is over because we are now growing again. But that clearly, it's a huge recession and one that nobody could have predicted, 5 months ago. So one big problem on the state level in terms of revenue is that April tax payments were deferred to July. And so this was something that the federal government did, IRS did, and just about every state, I'm not sure if there's a state that didn't do it, but I think just about every state that at least has an individual income tax also conformed to that, as did Arizona. So final income tax payments are now due in July. And that obviously moves a lot of some amount of money out of the fiscal year 20 equation into fiscal year 21, because fiscal year 21 starts July 1st. And the thinking there is, people who have refunds are more likely to file early. But if you think that you are going to owe the government money on your taxes, you're going to wait until the last possible minute, and therefore we're going to have some loss of revenue. Temporary, we will still get that money in July, but if you're looking at trying to balance your fiscal year 20 budget, that is a problem. Now, the estimated payment deadlines, the quarterly estimated payments, businesses filing sales estimated payments for July or for June in June for the larger businesses, those have not been deferred. So that does minimize, or at least not exacerbate, the amount of revenue loss temporary to fiscal year 21. Deferrals mostly an individual income tax issue. Corporations generally pay through quarterly estimates, so that's not a big issue. But all told, we thought in April that we'd lose about $676 million in general fund revenue collections from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21. Again, that's not an overall loss. That's just a temporary loss. But when you're looking at trying to balance an individual fiscal year, that's obviously difficult. So let's get into how we forecast revenues. So we have what's called a 4-sector forecast that uses 4 components. The first is what we call the Finance Advisory Committee, and that is a collection of 13 or 14 public and private sector economists that meet quarterly, or not quarterly, 3 times a year, including in April. So these slides were originally developed in conjunction with that FAC meeting. And so we survey them 3 times a year and say, what do you think is going to happen to revenues in these major categories? And they send those answers back, and we compile them, and their response makes up a quarter of the forecast. 2 other quarters of the forecast come from Dr. Hammond at the University of Arizona, who you'll be hearing from next week. They've got a model there that forecasts revenues. They have their base model, which is sort of their best guess estimate as to what will happen. And then they have another setting on their model that is low, and that is sort of an inherently conservative forecast to try to build in a little cushion, because in budgeting, it's always better to present decision makers with a little bit of good news rather than a little bit of bad news. And so that low forecast helps build in just a little bit of conservatism into the forecast. And then the other sector is our JLBC staff forecast. And so if you look at the bar graphs on the right-hand side of that slide, the blue bars represent what we think, what the April 4-sector forecast thought revenues would be with this deferral. And so remember, we're moving like $676 million out of fiscal year 20 into fiscal year 21. And so just looking at the raw numbers, you would see that the fiscal year 20 revenue would be 8.5% less than the prior fiscal year, but then fiscal 21, it would be 11% higher. And but that all has to do with the swing of the estimated, or the final payments moving from fiscal year 20 to 21. So a more realistic, a better view of what we think is literally happening in the economy or in revenues is in the yellow bars, and that's where we think overall, setting aside the deferral, we're going to lose about 2.8% in revenues in 20 compared to fiscal year 19, and another 1.5% in 21 compared to 20. And then in fiscal 22, we think revenues will certainly start to recover, but that just gives you a sense of what we think is going to happen in revenues. And you look at that and like 2.8% loss, that's not horrible. 1.5% isn't horrible, and it's not, but when the long run average growth was 4.2%, and when we were growing at 8% for the year previously, it's a pretty dramatic turnaround. Moving on then, the other component in terms of putting together the forecast in April, and we'll continue to do this, is that on the federal level, one of the COVID relief bills increased the federal Medicaid match rate, and that was retroactive to January. They increased it by 6.2%, and that's going to last as long as the federal emergency declaration. So that could be end of September, that could be end of December, that could even be into calendar year 2021. So that's good. That saves us not a small amount of money, not as much as the revenue loss, but it offsets it a bit. On the other hand, when you have a major downturn, economic downturn, you do expect some increase in public assistance and access caseloads. And so in July or in April, we had thought that caseloads would increase dramatically, and we had thought they could increase by 20% in July and maybe another 10% through fiscal year 21. And that really was a bit of a guess, but guided by previous experience, as we note here, caseloads grew by 27% in the Great Recession. And since it appeared that this recession certainly could reach the levels, certainly in terms of jobs losses, way exceeded the Great Recession, we thought that was at least a good benchmark for what might happen. As it turns out, thus far, we've not seen the caseload increases that we had perhaps thought. I think it's more on the order at this point of maybe 6 or 7% growth. So it could certainly grow maybe to 10% by July, and maybe it's a situation where caseloads continue to grow through fiscal year 21. But thus far, we haven't seen as high a caseload growth rate as we thought we might see. And so we took some savings in the budget forecast for that. So what does that mean for the state's ending balances? So we think we have, in April, we had forecasted a cash shortfall of $1.1 billion, which consisted of two components. One is the amount that would be incurred during fiscal year 20, and that is $638 million. And I would note that that assumes the loss of $676 million in revenues shifted from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21. So if we hadn't done that, it's possible that our forecast would have said, well, we think we might squeak by fiscal year 20 without a shortfall. But because that $676 million shift is just temporary, the better number to look at is the $1.1 billion shortfall, which is the combined shortfall between the 2 years. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how the legislature might solve that problem in a couple in the following slides, but note here that the Constitution does allow, on the state level, incurred debts to be paid in the following year. And so, and we have actually done that in the past. During the Great Recession, there was a year where the legislature kept on making budget changes, and we thought we solved the problem, and then we'd get new revenue numbers and we'd realize, oh, we haven't solved the problem. Then we'd make more changes, and it just got worse. And by the end of the year, it's like, well, we've made changes. We think they solved the problem, but if things get worse, they get worse. And so that is an option that the legislature could have if they wanted to address I mean, that's not intended to be something the states do, the state does repeatedly, but it is sort of intended. It's like, well, if we tried to solve the problem and it, for whatever reason, it didn't work, we can pay those debts in the following year. And as I noted on the earlier page, we had thought that the shortfall could be anywhere from $600 million to $1.6 billion, meaning a $500 million swing in either direction. Those cash shortfalls would persist through fiscal year 23, at least. You have a new shortfall in fiscal year 22 of $1 billion, and that assumes that we've resolved the fiscal year 21 shortfall, and that probably hasn't been resolved into 22. You know, a lot of the reason for the shortfall in 22 is that we definitely think that we are not getting that higher Medicaid match rate in fiscal year 22. And that generates us, in our April estimates, about $500 million worth of savings. So $500 million of our shortfall in 22 is the loss of that enhanced federal match. Also, these numbers are going to be wrong. These are our best estimates, but we always say, well, we know that the numbers, whatever the numbers are going to be, they're not going to be this. They're going to be off in some way. And certainly, as you try to forecast out, 3 years into the future, the accuracy of the estimates, they decline. If you're just off by 1% in each of the 3 years in the same direction, that could change the balance by $725 million to the good or to the bad. So it just, again, in terms of like trying to be humble about the degree to which we can accurately forecast revenues. You look at the federal government and the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, does 10-year budget forecasts, and I can't even imagine trying to forecast a budget out 10 years. I mean, it's got some slight value from a budget planning perspective, as does I think certainly a 3-year budget process does help from a planning perspective, but it only gives you the general sense of what might happen and is not going to be super accurate. So what might the state do to resolve its shortfall? Well, in terms of the 20 shortfall, the first thing we could do is roll that problem into 21 and resolve as part of the 21 budget changes. And as I noted before, we did this back in the Great Recession in fiscal year 09. A second option is we could take money out of the rainy day fund, which sits at nearly $1 billion. From a technical perspective, this is more state budgeting inside baseball. We probably have some flexibility so that we're not trying to guess a number and have that be too big or too small. We just sort of say, okay, in August, we're going to determine what the shortfall is, and we're going to authorize a transfer of that amount plus $1 million, so that we're not having to guess now. And that's what we did back at the end of fiscal year 08. We could try to use a federal funds offset. We'll talk about that in a moment. Fund transfers, we can wait till fiscal year 21 to do that. And agency budget reductions, those are hard to implement at the end of the fiscal year. You just don't get a lot of bang for your buck. That's certainly an option that the state could look at for fiscal year 21. So how might we approach the overall cumulative $1.1 billion shortfall? Well, as noted, we can use the rainy day fund. We can use the federal COVID dollars. and I'll talk a little bit more about that because that obviously you on the local level are also familiar with that. Fund transfers and revenue and spending adjustments. What are the federal fund options? Well, there was, and these numbers are slightly out of date now, given changes here in the past couple weeks. There's the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund. And those were monies, the state got $2.8 billion total to reimburse COVID-related spending. It was explicitly said that you can't just deposit these monies into the general fund. And that's true for the state, that's true for local jurisdictions. So as you probably know, the Phoenix, Tucson, Mesa, as well as Pima and Maricopa counties got individual set-asides of that $2.8 billion, which left about $1.8 to $1.9 billion at the state level. Local governments who were not Phoenix, Tucson, Mesa, Maricopa, Pima spent a lot of time lobbying the governor because these monies are controlled by the governor. Explicitly says in federal legislation that the governor controls these. The legislature does not have control over them. They lobbied for a share of it, and last week, the governor announced that he was going to share $441 million total from that $1.8, $1.9 billion with local governments. And what he said is, based on some subsequent federal guidance, that local governments could submit their public safety and public health expenditures, and they would be presumed to all be COVID related, and effectively locals would get their CRF, and they then could sort of cost offset those amounts, thereby generating some excess revenues, which then the county can use or the cities can use however they want, which presumably could be, for specific COVID related items, or, the fact that you're displacing what is presumably county general fund monies on public safety expenditures. Maybe that's going to resolve, offset some revenue losses on your part. On the state level, there's also a K-12 emergency relief fund. It was total $277 million. There is a maintenance of effort requirement, but we spend way more in our K-12 system than the maintenance of effort requirement level. So you could use some or all of that $277 million to supplant or supplement K-12 spending. In addition, there's $190 million for higher education emergency relief fund. We don't spend a lot of money above the maintenance of effort level in the universities, so it's much less likely we can get all of that 190 if we wanted to supplant it. And then there's governor's emergency education relief fund. The governor definitely determines that allocation, and so that was also available. So my final slide here is sort of what the next steps are, and I can just talk a little bit about sort of what steps of these we've done and what is left to happen. So as I noted at the beginning, it's hard to craft a solution when the magnitude of the problem is uncertain. So by early June, roughly now, we'll have more data to assess the problem. So we would have April and May withholding information. So a good way of sort of evaluating whether people are losing their jobs, or who's losing their jobs in terms of how that is affecting withholding. By early June, we'll have April TPT collection, and certainly y'all on the county level know that as well, that it takes a long time to get the TPT information, meaning businesses have until the end of the following month to pay their TPT. And so So the data we got, the data we're getting just now, and we're trying to review, that reflects April TPT collection. So April, the first month that we had a full loss, that we were fully under the pandemic. Businesses paid that by the end of May, and only now DOR is sort of reporting and compiling that information. So information we got in early May only reflected March TPT, and that obviously you had a couple weeks there that was effectively pre-pandemic, and it was hard to get a read on how bad or good things really were. So we plan to revisit our forecast at least once by June. We haven't done that yet. We still plan to do that here. That'll probably be, could be a couple weeks from now, but we have been, I will say that the May revenues that we reported in May, they were better. Setting aside some sort of temporary gains, which we think have nothing to do with, are just temporary and would wash themselves out here in the May collections that'll be reported in June. But we were $100 million to the good. So maybe that $600 million to $1.6 billion range, maybe, I mean, we certainly didn't update our forecast because things were so immediate, but members at least have thought, well, maybe that range is now 500 million to 1.5 billion. So that's one of the things we're monitoring in terms of revenue collections. And then, our office is trying to develop potential solution sets that could be implemented near the beginning of the fiscal year. And obviously, there are going to be differing views from members and from the executive as to how they might want to solve that problem, depending on the size of the problem. You're going to have members who might just want to solve it all by using the rainy day fund. You're going to have members who are going to want to do more permanent cuts, and obviously there's any range of solutions in between matters. So that, I believe, is the last slide in the slideshow. So let me just, yes, it is. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and happy to take questions.
All right, Stefan, can you still hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you need to share again so our audience can hear you.
Oh, okay.
So share again and I'll send it. All right, so just you can stay there like that. I do have a question as we're going to talk about types of budgets and budget adoption process here in a little bit. Gotcha. Back on the screen here. What about line item vetoes up there?
So the governor does have the ability to line item veto. What the legislature did in April was pass what came to be known as the quote unquote skinny budget. And what that budget reflected was effectively the JLBC baseline with a handful of changes. And so the governor at the time could have line item vetoed certain expenditures in there. The governor chose not to do that. The governor just signed the budget bill as passed. And generally, certainly the goal, I think, in recent years has been to try to come to an agreement between the legislature and the governor that there need not be line item vetoes. So I'm trying to think back the last time. I think the last time there were line item vetoes, it was probably Governor Brewer and in the Great Recession. And I think that had to do those were broader line item vetoes. I think the last time there were vetoes that were the governor expressing displeasure with something passed by the legislature, probably at some point in the Napolitano administration. So that's certainly a power that the governor has. The governor, there's a court case that says the governor can't tell agencies not to spend money. There is an appropriation that is a direction from the legislature to an agency that the governor has signed that says you have to spend money on X. So there's a court case that says Rios v. Symington is the name of the court case, has to do with a legislator, Pete Rios, suing, who's the lead in a lawsuit against Governor Symington at the time. So the governor can't just tell his or her agencies, yeah, you know that appropriation for X, don't spend it. There are probably ways that the executive branch can slow walk some spending, but they can't literally say to an agency, don't spend that money.
Interesting. So we don't have any questions. We actually had an issue with our link, so you've been spared. It only went out to employees and not the public.
Oh, okay.
But I do have one thing that I know you can't change it, but I want you to push it up for me, okay? I'm an American and a capitalist, so I don't think the TPT should be called a privilege tax. It should be a right. That's just a personal thing that grinds my gears, so if you can do anything about that.
Well, I will say that most people, we just call it sales tax, and therefore usually it's trying to tell people, well, technically speaking, it's not a sales tax, it's a privilege tax. So that is the first time I've heard that that argument before. I'll make sure to pass that on, at least to the economists here on staff. They'll I think be interested to hear that perspective.
Well, thank you so much. I don't have any more questions. We're really happy you could chime in down here, especially during this time. So if you don't have anything else, I'll unshare you, and you're more than welcome to listen to me drone on for another 20 minutes.
Okay, I will probably listen in, and I'll probably turn off my camera, but I will listen in and appreciate again the opportunity to talk to y'all. And certainly, if you have any questions about state budget questions, feel free to shoot me an email, drop me a line.
All right, thank you so much. And I will follow up to get your slides so we can post those up as well.
Okay, will do.
All right, thanks so much, Stefan. We appreciate it.
Sure, thanks, y'all. Bye.
All right, everybody. Looks like it's on me now. Let me grab a sip of coffee and we'll get into this. All right, so today we got some budget history types in the adoption process. It's not terribly exciting, but it's interesting to see how budgets have changed over time and where we've gotten to where we are. All right. So there's been a lot of different eras of budgets over the history of the United States. And I know that sounds super dry, but I think it's kind of neat. So last week we started with the US Constitution about what gave cities and states the right to exist and what powers they have. Well, what about the right to budget? If you look at the Constitution, just glancing through, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, etc. Okay. They can generate revenue. Another mention, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be used for longer than 2 years. Okay, we're talking about appropriations. Keep going, get to Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. So that is the the greatest mention of budget in the U.S. Constitution. I try to always elevate my position, but there's not much reference to budget in the Constitution, and it's pretty weak from time to time. So next time my boss asks me when the budget's going to be due, I'm going to go, from time to time. So what did we start out with? We started out with lump sum budgets. In reality, this was dominated by the legislative branch. They gave a lump sum. They said, here's some money, do what you're going to do. And I like the quote there. It was, Congress did this in a more or less haphazard manner. And at one point, our early budgets as a country were described as the only great nation without a budget system. So think about that. Like, I was reading a book about John Wesley Powell and the BLM and Bureau of Land Management and going out exploration out west. They just gave him a chunk of money to go do it. It wasn't, they didn't know exactly what he's spending it on. These type of budgets, they're not really supported by data or estimates of anything. There's little standardization in accounting, and the departments bargained with the legislature directly. So as this changed over time, and at the municipal level, they would just do a levy. It wasn't about revenues or expenses. They just say, here's a levy to run the government. They wouldn't even tell you what the expenses or revenues were. It was just the levy. So as this moved on, we got more into an era of control of the budget. And this is when I asked Stefan, where is the budget? Is it in the legislative or the executive branch? And here we see a graphic, it's the push and pull between the three branches, or the checks and balances we all learned about in Civics 101. So what happened is that after we kind of grew out of this lump budget stage or phase, we're growing up as a country and going more towards control. Who has control over the budget? And this is where it was moved, again, not everywhere, but from the legislative to the executive. Here at the county, the executive branch does the budget and presents it to the legislature. And that's why I asked Stefan about the line item veto. When we present a budget to the Board of Supervisors, can they veto it or deny it at the line item level? And the answer is no. They approve the budget as a whole or not. They don't go, well, I want to approve your budget, but I want you to knock down wages 5%. Can't do that. And we'll get more into that later. So this is kind of what we call the progressive era of budgets. And this is where I'm proud to be in the municipal side. Think about it, there's one federal budget, but there's 50 states, but by sheer volume, there's thousands and thousands of municipalities. So all this innovation came from the municipalities because there were just more of them doing more things. Late 19th century, our man Woodrow Wilson was also a proponent of the public administration movement. Last week when we talked about the different types of government, the mayor, council, the mayor, or council mayor, and council manager. Council manager is where the council hires or appoints a professional manager. And that's where you're seeing this, the turn of the 19th century into this professional management. And with that came the budget control from the legislative to the executive. And really, in the 19th century, it was described as growing hostility to doing business in the dark, to boss rule and invisible government. It's the soil in which the budget idea finally took root and grew. Before that, it was just lump sums where, New York City Police Department got $1 million. No one knew what they did with it. All right. Line item budgets. As we started getting into the professional manager and professional budget officer as professions, we started describing what we're going to do even more and more. So it listed things by line item. So here's just an example of some county line items. We have the 6 digits. It's nothing too exciting, but we say, okay, we're going to spend $25 million on wages, and our revenue for property tax is $24 million. So it's explaining where the money's coming in and where it's going out. One of the cons is that it doesn't focus on policy issues or choices. It focuses on what we're buying and not what we're doing. Okay, as we advance further and further, we get into what I don't like, which we call the baseline budget. So I call this the financial manifestation of the greatest critique of government. We've always done it that way. So what does this mean? We take last year's budget and adjust at the margins. How much new revenues do we have? Okay, well, that's our new expenses. Or how much did revenues go down? Okay, then we have to cut that much. But you never look at what is in the other 98% of the budget. So thinking like an economist, you think at the margins, what's one extra unit going to cost? What's the value? But we just say, okay, what's our change in tax from last year? And then we adjust our expenditures there. So why is this? And it is a critique of government. Why do we do it? Do we have lazy employees or lazy elected leaders? Well, it's a simpler budget process. There's less work, and we have few budget analysts that are hired. If you look at how many financial professionals we have in the county, accountants and finance managers, there's only one, which is me, doing the actual budget. And when you have a $200 million budget, you can't take a $200 million budget and have it redone every year by one person. So there's an advantage to that. But the other side is we live in a political environment. It's called democracy. And I joke, in the US, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but in China, the lifted nail gets the hammer. You know, we're adults. We have to acknowledge we live in a political environment. For example, would you endorse a budget cut during an economic boom when times are great? Are you going to think your political leader's crazy for trying to cut something? You know, even though, let's say it's a data-based decision. I mean, we all know sales 101 is people buy based on their emotions, not based on data or numbers. So I do have a quote from one of my textbooks here. The absorptive character of government, gradually adapting and incrementally augmenting its activities, suggests that change may more easily be measured on a time scale congenial to a forester or a geologist than to a Congress or White House in a hurry. And that's from 1977. So baseline budget, we live in a political environment and we just can't redo the budget every year. I wrote down a quote here. I was reading a book about, how we think in psychology, and one quote that stuck out to me is, turns out we'd rather die than change. So interesting stuff. All right. Performance budget. As we keep going through the 20th century, we're learning how to do budgets differently. And we've gone from the era of control, where we had a new professional manager. Now we're trying to talk about management. And this kind of goes from, our New Deal to post-World War II. So we look at performance, inputs. What are we putting in? And I like the example of, solving homelessness. So inputs. Let's say government steps up a task force or a department to solve homelessness. What are our inputs? Well, we have 2 employees and a kitchen to provide meals. Okay, what are our outputs? Our outputs could be, we've contacted 100 homeless people and we've provided 1,000 meals. That's an output. What's the efficiency? So the cost per unit. So based on our budget, $100,000, and we've provided, 10,000 meals this year. Do the math. I'm making this up off the top of my head. Okay, we can produce these meals for people at $1 per meal, so we're efficient. But then effectiveness, is the product doing anything? What if, for example, people that were affluent were sneaking into the soup kitchen getting free lunches? Well, we're pumping out a lot of lunches. They're cheap, but they're not effective because they're not going to the right people. But the outcome is the actual problem. So when we're trying to house these people, we could say we've gotten 100 people off the streets, which is great. But like they do in Tucson at the Tucson Pima collaboration for homelessness, once a year they do a point in time count where they get volunteers together to see how many homeless people are actually out there. Well, let's say they do that count at the end of this year, and all of a sudden they say, well, there's 1,000 people that are homeless right now. And then I look at my performance and go, oh, we only housed 100. So my outcome is I've only solved 10% of the problem. So it's really important that we look not at outputs, how many lunches we've served, but outcomes. What have we actually done? This is an example of how budgets have changed to be more cognizant of management. Another example is programmatic budgeting. And this is really breaking those line items up into categories so they can say what they're doing. For example, sheriff's office, they have control, investigations, and jail. So instead of saying we give the sheriff $8 million for salaries, now we can say, okay, 5 for patrol, 1 for investigation, 2 for jail, etc. You can see the other programs there where we divide things up. We group these line items so we can see what programs they're actually doing. All right, the next is we're still in this management era, and this is my favorite, but it's difficult. And I like this one. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. It's budget time. No, you don't just get the same budget you had last year because you've always had it. Sit down, explain to the budget officer what you do, what's your product, and why you need this money. Example is looking at, let's just say, the public defender. If I sat down with the public defender and go, okay, tell me why you need this budget. He goes, well, I do this many felonies, this many misdemeanors, and according to the case law, which went to the Arizona Supreme Court, the Joe U. Smith case, I can only have my attorneys carrying this many caseloads, otherwise it degrades the quality of the defense I provide. So I do the math and go, okay, you need 8.5 attorneys, so here's money for 8.5 attorneys. Well, the truth is we don't have the budget staff or the political will to do this every year. So this one started in the 1960s at the Department of Agriculture, and our favorite Jimmy Carter brought it to the state of Georgia, and then Washington after that. And really, it's the antithesis of your baseline budgeting because there's little or no scrutiny in the traditional budget process. It's more accurate, but you need more budget analysts, more time, and there's more political friction. As we're still going in this management and trying to shift to see what phase of budget we're in now, or the era or school of thought. Another one is priority-based budgeting, which I don't see a lot. I put the baseball scorecard up there because some of the articles I've seen or the way I've seen it pitched is where you rank programs or departments based on certain things, but it's too objective, it's too numeric, and there's certain, depending on which school of thought, you would maybe rank a program based on the revenue it generated, but that's not really how we do things as a government. I can't judge the county attorney based on how much revenue he generates because that's not his job, is to generate revenue. So I don't feel that this is a good way to do it. Another one that I prefer, which is more in this era where we shifted to management to now planning and priorities, is a strategic approach where it's based on your strategic plan or your strategy for the government over the length of the next 5 or 10 years. So with this, it's taking these planning and priorities, which we wanted to do in a priority-based budget, but that's not the system, and reporting to the citizens saying, okay, what are our priorities as an organization? Here's Cochise County priorities, so you can see what was adopted in our last strategic plan. And then how do we base our budget off those? So you'll see that in the county with funding requests, that all funding requests are tied to our strategic plan. Okay, so that's kind of where we're coming in to the 21st century. We started out with lump sum and control. Then it went from management and then priority and planning, and then now to strategic, where what are we doing strategically with the money over the next 10 years? So what do we have in Cochise County? I joke it's a little of this and a little of that. It's a little bit of everything. So lump sum. It's when we give a department money, it's lump sum as far as they get X amount for personnel and X amount for operating. And those you can't mix them. If you can't spend salary money to go buy a truck for public works, or you can't take the money that you're going to spend on fuel and put it towards raises because they have different implications year over year. So what about the executive budget? Yeah, in the county we have an executive budget because it's completed the executive level, because myself and all county employees are in the executive branch. What about line item budget? Yeah, we have a line item budget because all our funds are in specific line items. Baseline budget. Yeah, some of our budget is baseline where most of the county budget is carried over from the prior year. Program. Yeah, we do have a programmatic budget because within our baseline budget and our line items, they're divided into programs. So I could look at the sheriff's budget and say, okay, that's patrol, that's investigation, that's administration, and that's jail. So it's divided up very nicely and easy to understand. What about zero-based? Yeah, we do have some zero-based budgeting when you have a new program. So for example, the county attorney's office stepped up the GRACE program this year, and that's for people with mental illnesses. Well, when we built that program, I worked very closely with the county attorney's office, and we built a program from the ground up that said, okay, if we have a new program, what do we need? We need new employees. So we went to HR and did a job description. We did a market analysis of what that position should pay. We looked at what training they should have, what professional organization should they be a part of, what office supplies do you need for one extra person. We went to IT, said, okay, what is one extra computer for one extra position cost? So it's an example of how you build something up from zero. And last, strategic. Yeah, the county does have a strategic plan, and when you look at all of our funding requests, right there in the letters to the department says if you want something new or you want to change your funding, you need to tell us how it's tied to the strategic plan. Okay, so those are some different types of budget types, budget processes, and how it's really changing this country over the last 200 years. You know, it's always influenced by that executive legislative conflict, push and pull we started talking about last week. And then at the local level, it's still centered around your full-time professional executives and part-time legislators. And it's under the management of that council manager form of government. So that's how the budget's changed. All right, a little bit about the budget adoption process. Before we talk about that, everybody says, oh, is the budget balanced? Well, what does that even mean? So the budget is balanced when for the year your projected expenses and your revenues are the same. So our expenses on capital and operations and personnel need to all add up. And then when we add up our revenues, our sales tax, our property tax, and our reserves, it needs to be the same so that we can say, okay, we're not going to spend more money than we're going to take in. But there's another dynamic to this where this doesn't mean you're in a healthy organization. We need to break it up once more and look at recurring and one time. So are my recurring expenses and recurring revenues balanced? So the money I'm going to spend on personnel and operations, which is a recurring expense, balanced to my sales tax and property tax, which are recurring revenues. That means I'm not spending my savings account. So I'm balancing my recurring expenses, my checkbook, and I also need to balance my savings account, and that's our one-time stuff. So one-time expenses are for capital or vehicles or buildings, something we may buy once every 5 years. And our one-time revenues are your reserves. And I've included PILT there. That's a payment from the federal government. It's called the payment in lieu of taxes because the federal government doesn't pay property taxes. So when we have all this national forest, national parks, and the Fort Huachuca, they don't pay property taxes. At the end of the federal budget cycle, they say, well, we'll give the county some money because we don't pay property taxes. It can change, so we count that, responsibly as a one-time revenue. And maybe there's a settlement for this or that, or some type of windfall, as you would call in your personal finances. The biggest take on this is reserves. So you don't want to spend your reserves paying for recurring expenses. So let's say there's a one-time short-term revenue loss. Then you could say, okay, maybe I'll spend a little bit for something small, some small emergency that happened and we lost some revenue. So you really have to balance both sides of these individually to say we have a balanced budget and that we're also fiscally healthy. All right, a little primer on what makes up expenses, and we'll get to this more next week when we talk about local government expenses and revenues and how we actually build the budget. But there's a lot at the department level. You have your fleet expenses, grant matches and funding requests that they have, and payroll. We have to market wages, retirements, your payroll taxes, worker comp. Those are all taxes that make up the payroll that we have to calculate every year. And we still have state costs. We help pay the Department of Revenue. We pay for our Arizona healthcare containment system, and those are determined by the states, or by the state. What makes up revenues? You might have seen pie charts in our last presentation. Sales tax, local half-cent, state sales tax, and that's dependent on the economy. Property tax, assessment rate, levy, collection rate. And I'm going over this pretty quick because we're going to get into this next week. Next week, that's what this is all about. But as the budget process, during the budget process, these are all the pieces of the pie that we need to ask about or learn. And other, fees and fines, charges for service, IGA or intergovernmental revenue. Again, your PILT, your payment in lieu of taxes from the federal government. Budget adoption process. So this is how we adopt the process, and you can see the timeline. We do this every year. February, March, we get the requests in from the departments and the offices about what they want. In April, we start looking at revenues and expenses. We project out how they're going to balance this year at that recurring and one-time level. And then comes May, we see if the budget is going to be balanced at those levels, and if we need to make any gives or takes. Do we have more money to spend on certain things, or do we need to take things away? And then we balance the budget and take that to the Board of Supervisors on June. And there's two budget adoptions. There's the tentative and the final. So this is when I asked Stefan about the line item veto. So if I present the budget to the Board of Supervisors and they don't like one specific line item for salaries and they think it's too high, they can't adopt it and go, we vote on this contingent on you decreasing salaries by 5%. You can't do that. So we don't have the line item veto authority here. But when we go from the tentative to the final, there is a discussion where I present that budget in mid-June, and then we talk and say, okay, we've balanced the budget, but I'll get feedback and say there's a few things here I don't like. So at that point, I could change those if it still balances the budget, and then when they get the final budget in July, they didn't do a line item veto, but because there's two steps in the process, the board has that voice and authority to make those changes. But when it comes to the final, that's it. It's a yes or no. And you can't change anything at the line item. I mean, if it's a no, then I have to go back to the drawing board and see what needs to be changed and bring it back. But at that day when they take the vote, you can't veto at the line item. It's budget yes or no as a whole. And then come August, we adopt the tax rates. So I put the red dotted line there. That is July 1st, and that's our fiscal year when the year starts. So it's important to note that we go into the fiscal year without a final budget. And that's okay, because the state lets us do that per statute. And it lets us do that because, one, we have a tentative budget, so we can start the year with a tentative plan. And they also acknowledge that the state budget normally gets adopted, prior to that. So we need to almost wait for the state budget to learn what they're going to charge us or some of their revenue projections before we do ours. And that's one of these processes where, okay, we're going to go into the year with a tentative, a best guess, and because we just found out what the state's going to do, and now we have a couple more weeks to actually iron it out and do the final. The last thing is the tax rates, your property tax rates. Those don't get adopted till August. Why? Because your property tax bills don't go out until September. And that is important as well. The board adopts these rates for every special district. And I do want to take a chance to to not, I don't want to say defend, but explain that relationship. So your school districts, they set the levy, the amount they want to raise, and then it's the responsibility of the board to do the math, calculate a tax rate, and then make sure it's legal, and then say, okay, your rate is approved and we adopt it. But the board doesn't set the tax rates for school districts, special districts, fire districts, cities, or towns. It's just as we talked last week, the county is an arm of the state. So when any of the other municipalities or districts adopt their budget, they need to go through an arm of the state for a last minute check or approval to get that tax rate and levy that they choose approved. So in a couple of weeks, we'll really get into property taxes and special districts. Okay, so I kind of went through this pretty quick because we had a really good conversation with Stefan this morning from the JLBC. So I'll look and see if anybody has any questions, but that's a real quick history of budgets and the types and how they've changed, since the founding of this country, and the authority from the Constitution that allows budgets to exist and exist as a control mechanism. So that's all I got for you guys this week. I appreciate you sticking with me. We actually did the full 90 minutes today. A couple of notes, I will get the schedule on the website today, and then this talk and the prior talk, along with all the slideshows, will be for viewing and download on the website. And do pass the word, we had an issue with the link, so guests could not join it. This one was only for those with Microsoft Teams, so our employees in the county. So do spread the word. Next week we'll get that fixed, and we're going to keep on trucking. So thanks for listening to me talk about the history of budgets. And I'm going to hang out here and see if anybody has any questions. I don't have any questions yet, but I'll show a couple documents that I want everybody to know we have. So if you go to the county website, I'll bring it up here. Okay, so county home, departments, finance, annual county budgets. These are all the budget documents that we put out, and really the goal is, like we talked about, the purpose of the budget is accountability and getting this out to the public. So a couple of them that I'm really proud of are what we've done in the last few years, and that's the adopted and tentative books we did last year and the actual detailed budget book. Let me get those up. So if you download these two right here, the adopted or tentative, the tentative is that June one and the adopted is the July. But they both look like this, and this is a basic overview of the budget that we adopt. A transmittal letter which explains the difference, and this is where you can really see that baseline budget, where the things we talk about are really only the changes, but it also talks about the changes in revenues as well. So here is the grouping of funds. And then general fund, what every department had this year and the prior year. So go through that. Special revenue funds, see what departments have grants, what departments have capital improvement funds, enterprise funds, and we'll get into fund structures next week. An enterprise fund is a fund that's run like a business. Our special districts, these are those special districts that the board doesn't really control, but sets the rate. And then every department has a one-pager about how their budget's changed and what they do. So that's a good one to check out. And then the last one is the actual detailed budget book. And this is quite a read, but definitely check this out. I think this is probably the most comprehensive and publicly available budget document this county's ever done. So check this out. It's a lot, but do go through this. And you get into everything from long-term financial plans, priority just overview issues, our org chart, fund structure, the budget process, and then every very detailed information about revenues and expenses. And I'll get to it here, every department has a little one-pager about their expenses and their function statement and their changes and what they do. So do check this out. It's on the website, and these are last year's, and as we go through the budget process, they will be put up for this year as they're adopted. I don't have any questions, and it's been a full 90 minutes, so we'll end it here, and I'll say thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate it.